Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inside the Joint Investigative Staff briefing book cover, we find the topic of today's hearings, i.e. Lessons learned, and I'm talking about the 93 World Trade Center, the 96 bombing of the Khobar Towers, the 98 attacks on our embassies, 99 the planned attack during the millennium, and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole. I think the attack on the USS Cole is really a microcosm of the challenges we face in regards to 9/11. And I'm pleased to announce the Intelligence Committee's findings of a week ago in regards to our findings and recommendations in reference to the Cole. Finding number one, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, aggressively collected and promptly disseminated raw intelligence pertaining to potential terrorist threats. Although the intelligence community analysts in Washington often had access to intelligence available on the global terrorist activities, they did not always enhance their products with historical information. As a result, field operators and analysts with limited resources to apply to historic research were often left with that task. The process was further hampered by limitations on intelligence sharing. There's a lot of changes, I'm paraphrasing here, in the intelligence community, but the lack of historical context for terrorist threat products and failure to abide by warning guidelines is a problem. Finding three, intelligence available prior to the attack on the Cole was not provided to consumers in a formal warning product prepared and issued by the Interagency Intelligence Committee on Terrorism. We have some recommendations where we asked the DCI to report back to us basically with a detailed description of the steps the intelligence community is taking to increase the analytical depth on the terrorist targets. Second, to revise the existing procedures and standards for issuing any formal intelligence committee warning products. That system should include a streamlined interagency and coordination process, clear and concise standards for issuing warnings, and a system of threat ratings for the consumer incorporating such factors as the immediacy, the significance, and the reliability of the threat. Now, note all the way through this, and the reason I went to the length of reading that is that we keep coming back to the bottom line in regards to the Cole, any of these lessons learned in this whole investigation, and that is the need for better analytical ability and a better predictive warning, I guess, analysis. And so put another way, with all due respect to my colleagues, I don't think many of us have had an opportunity to meet or visit with or learn from a real, live, experienced, regular analyst or understand what it is they really do. It's a lot like when you leave your car in the garage and the mechanic that you never see. The manager and the customer relation guy takes your car, he makes you feel good, but the mechanic does the work. Well, we have such a witness, Mr. Kie Fallis. And Kie, if you would take the end of the witness table, I would appreciate it. Mr. Fallis is a former Army interrogator. He is fluent in Farsi. He's an Iran specialist. He spent 1 year with the FBI investigating the Khobar Towers situation. He is an expert in recognizing the computer software analytical capability and workable databases. Using his background and training and ability, Mr. Fallis provided what has been labeled a Osama bin Laden blueprint of various methods and connections. And the result, the same terrorists who planned the previous attacks were also planning the next attacks. He received the Distinguished Performance rating from the DIA in July of 2000. Mr. Fallis then tracked the al-Qaeda for a year, linked them to Iranian intelligence and terrorist cells. In January of 2000, he predicted 2 or 3 major attacks against the United States. He noted that the broadcasts by UBL are followed by attacks. He made the connection to Iran, and that connection resulted in the infamous 2000 Malaysia meeting of the al-Qaeda. Some fellow by the name of Midhar and some fellow by the name of Hazmi. those linked to the Cole attack, and later also 9/11. He attempted in vain to convince his superiors to issue a threat warning in August of 2000. Mr. Fallis basically analyzed two warning streams of intelligence reporting, the Al-Qaeda and Iran, and tried to get his draft warning approved. His warnings were considered, I think they were called anomalies, not connections. We now know different. The NSA issued the warning the day after the attack. Mr. Fallis, acting out of conscience, citing significant, very different analytical differences, then resigned the day after the Cole attack. Upon request, he did provide this committee and the Armed Services Committee valuable insight and suggestions at the time of the Cole investigation. He is now an intelligence consultant. I would like to bring to the attention of my colleagues a book called Breakdown by Bill Gertz, a local and respected reporter. On pages 31 to 59, you can have the saga in regards to Kie Fallis and what we should have learned. Mr. 59, you can have the saga in regards to Kie Fallis and what we should have learned. Mr. Fallis has prepared testimony today citing three notable differences between various analysts in the intelligence community and several recommendations in behalf of all the hardworking analysts who, in his words, represent the linchpin of our nation's ability to predict all future events and to warn the policymakers of important and very crucial developments in the world. Mr. Fallis, please feel free to summarize your statement, and I have just a couple of questions following that if we have time.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Mr. Chairman, members of these committees, I'd like to tell you that it's a great honor for me to come before you today to have a discussion about the subject at hand, and I would also like to say it's a great honor for me to be a part of this group of distinguished Americans at the table here as well. That said, my comments today will be strictly from the perspective of a former terrorism analyst employed at the Defense Intelligence Agency. What I'd like to do is to briefly summarize my written statement, and I want to move sort of immediately to this part on terrorism analytical issues complicating improved future performance. The single most important issue that will affect future performance is the experience level of the analyst. While this certainly applies to all intelligence analysts regardless of subject area, it is even more critical for those trying to prevent the next terrorist attack. In the case of an analyst responsible for tracking a Middle Eastern terrorist group, this person will need to have an expertise or at least a good working knowledge of terrorism itself, the group that they have for an account, regional and country issues present in the group's operating area, which can be quite extensive, and Islamic history, culture, and the sects thereof. This sort of required level of expertise is rarely going to be found outside the intelligence community and is instead going to be recruited from academia and then developed in-house through training programs and mentors. Coupled with this issue of experience comes the ability to place current intelligence reporting in the context of historical perspectives. In the period leading up to the 1998 East Africa bombings and the 2000 attack against the USS Cole in Yemen, terrorism analysts nearly across the board incorrectly assessed that a group would not conduct an attack in an area where it was able to operate with relative ease. Additionally, there appears to be a continued reluctance to correctly assess and evaluate the nature of cooperation between many Sunni and Shia Islamic extremist groups. Both of these examples, and there are certainly others, occurred despite over a decade of credible reporting to the contrary. The other significant issue complicating future analytical performance against terrorists is the tendency of the FBI to compartment all pre- and post-attack investigative information. I realize this committee has spent a great deal of its time looking at the many legal and other aspects of this problem, and I am not qualified to comment on those findings. However, as a former terrorism analyst and liaison officer to the FBI, I can tell you that having this information is critically important to being able to predict a future event. If the community's analysts are left in the dark about how a group puts an attack together, and each group does tend to do things a little differently, how will those analysts be able to pick up on future indicators of a future attack? Quite frankly, it's nearly impossible. As an example, the investigative results of the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing were not disseminated until almost 2 years after the event, and then only to a few select analysts and agencies. Another issue would have occurred right prior to the 1998 East Africa bombings, and that U.S. agencies had conducted a vigorous investigation to include a physical search of the al-Qaeda cell leader in Nairobi almost a year prior to this bombing. Almost all of the results of this effort weren't shared with the terrorism analytical community due to concerns, legitimate concerns about the criminal case. Most of the information was never properly exploited. And after the embassy bombings, the post-attack investigative results were not shared. Now, as a result, by failing to share the information, bin Laden analysts were unable to build a correct modus operandi for al-Qaeda attacks, and like the Khobar Towers example, they were unable to attach the proper level of importance to those culpable individuals still at large. This directly contributed to most analysts having only a moderate level of interest in the January 2000 Malaysia meeting of al-Qaeda operatives, when in fact the same node that had organized the meeting in Malaysia was in fact responsible for a great deal of the planning for the East Africa bombings. Moving on to my conclusions, the collection of additional information, further reorganizations, and the hiring of additional analysts is unlikely to significantly affect any of these issues. The central hub in our nation's past, present, and future failures and successes in the counterterrorism arena will rest squarely on the shoulders of the working level, all-source analysts in both the law enforcement and intelligence community. These men and women are the hard-working patriots who will have to try and find that single piece of hay in a stack of needles, and then try to tie it to another disparate piece of information in a timely manner. This will never be an easy job for them to accomplish, but the leadership of America's intelligence and law enforcement communities must provide them with the training, tools, and information to accomplish the mission. The information they need to successfully predict and prevent the next terror attack is probably already contained in one or more databases inside the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement communities. The only question is whether experienced working-level analysts will be given access to that information and will properly integrate that material into an accurate advisory or warning. Thank you, and that would conclude my remarks.
Let me just follow up with a question, if I might. How did the use of the analytical software tools and the databases that you put together that gave you insight in regards to the draft that you tried to prepare improve your ability to produce the intelligence assessments on various terrorist groups, and how do we get that information to the analyst as you have just described?
In my case, Senator, what I did is I began to notice that there was a voluminous amount of information, as others have testified to, regarding al-Qaeda. Most of it appeared to be unrelated to other pieces of information. It appeared to be almost chaff. By using a piece of software that I was able to put these small snippets of information into and graphically represent them as well, I was able to, over a course of many months, to determine certain linkages between these items. Linkages that would never be apparent without the use of this tool. It would simply be lost in the weeds, and there were a lot of weeds to look through. The reason it makes it easier by using this, and then it makes it much easier to collaborate with other analysts in the intelligence community, in the FBI, CIA, and others, to bring your findings, share their findings, and then work together towards a common goal of preventing the next attack.
We've heard from Ms. Hill, and in other hearings that we often do not anticipate these attacks. How can we do better?
By making better use of the information that we've already collected, quite frankly. We have literally a treasure trove of intelligence information spanning back decades, and the proper examination of that information, the proper databasing and building of relationships with that information, I think will give us the results, not all the way to the extent that we might want them, but it will take us a lot further than we are now.
We've heard that in order to get the warnings out to the right people, that it would represent a flood to the policymakers and others with what we call constant vague warnings or warning fatigue. How can we ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, that's a very difficult thing to accomplish, because too few warnings and the information is not going to get across. Too many and you induce warning fatigue. I think the answer lies in the analytical effort against terrorist groups to be conducted more efficiently and effective, to gather the details mined from the data that are there, put them together into a collaborative assessment, and then produce better and more correct and more thorough warning products, perhaps fewer, but more prescient and more accurate.
Senator Rudman called for bringing in outside experts on a more regular and systematic basis, and our inquiry has heard from others that some in the intelligence community at times lack the expertise. Can these experts be found, and can they be brought in to improve analysis?
Oh, absolutely, and that was done routinely, and frequently individuals in the Counterterrorism Center, the leadership there, would attempt to bring in academic experts and others, and I would say that they contributed a lot to the effort of the community's analysts.
I want to ask you a question that appears to be, perhaps too basic, but how do you do your job? It's a lot like when my daughter asked me when she knew I was a senator, and she said, "Well, Daddy, what do you really do? When you go to work." I want to know, how do you do your job? Can you describe the type of information you use and how you put it together and what happens to it then? Just give us an idea from a typical, although you're an atypical analyst, from your background and your work. And I thought it was prescient, but I understand now that it's prescient. But at any rate, to that ability that you have, what do you do when you get up in the morning and you go in and you're an analyst?
The first thing I would generally do, Senator, would be to look through all of the national products that would be available to me in my message queue in a computer terminal that would be sitting on my desk, to sort of set the ground for what had been happening in the previous 24 hours. From that point, I would move to a message traffic handling system where I had built a profile of certain key words that would hit on certain messages being brought in. You then sometimes have up to 200 messages a day to read through. From those, I would try to pick out the most compelling information, the most accurate, the best sourced to begin populating my database with. Then throughout the day, you'd be talking to your counterparts at the CTC or the FBI, and putting together assessments or other products as directed. It could be exciting, and at times it could be mind-numbing.
Is this what we call rocket science? Is this really hard work? We hear about the analyst who has to have all this expertise and background, et cetera. So you have that. You're fluent in Farsi. You're a student of that part of the world. In terms of recruiting and training, how tough is this?
The act of doing the analysis and producing the assessments is not, it's certainly not a rocket science. And it certainly isn't pushing any intellectual boundaries. It does require time to build the experience to become what you would call a working level or a journeyman level analyst. There's nothing special about it. As I related to both committees, I certainly did nothing special in the period leading up to the attack on the USS Cole. I think all I did was consistently read all of the traffic I could, and then instead of just moving on to something else, taking the traffic and trying to exploit every piece of information in it to see where that would take me.
Bottom line, do you have a recommendation in regards to, in behalf of all your analyst colleagues out there who are doing the hard-working work, as opposed to all of the very important and necessary officials we normally have here who testify?
I would say that we need two things increased, two areas of concern that are going to have to be addressed, and that is the ability of analysts across the community to collaborate on their efforts, and in doing this collaboration, to have the most possible information available to them. Obviously, we have to be concerned about whether people are properly cleared. They have to be in order to receive certain information read into certain programs, but by reaching that sort of apex of good, experienced, hard-working analysts with the tools they need to do the job, I think that we will have a lot of the information to predict the next act of terrorism. And more importantly, even now looking back at the information that we had, many people will say, well, that was too vague, that wasn't quite enough, that didn't point to this, and that's absolutely true. But if it had been put together, and if the gaps had been properly tasked out to collectors to follow up on and to exploit, there's no telling where that could have led to.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.